Hey, welcome back. This is Shah. I hope you enjoyed my last video in which I covered Walter from Fresh and Fit and his current situation with Daisy Chen. He's been accused of getting her pregnant, and we heard a phone call of him asking her to get an abortion. Since then, there's been a lot of updates to the case. Daisy has gone on several podcasts. Fresh and Fit themselves have done a show. We now know that, this isn't fake, because Walter has admitted to having unprotected relations with her. So it's definitely a possibility that he's the father.
First and foremost,
We do have the phone call.
we do have the phone call, but I will say this. I personally should not have nutted within a 304 like this. Now, granted, things happen, whether true or not, but like you said, James, I'll keep my mouth shut because I have some info here I want to share with the chat.
They've also retained James Sexton to the case.
But revenge is a dish best served cold.
Wait,
And right now,
Okay.
there are civil and criminal penalties for the kinds of behaviors that we're looking at right now. So I want you, as your counsel, and again, you're free to ignore my advice. Plenty of times people ignore my advice, and sometimes I'm grateful when they do it because it creates a lot more chaos, which makes me a lot more money. Peace does not make me any money. Chaos makes me money. But I'm telling you, my advice to you, and I've said this to you earlier privately, is there has to be, for the moment, no specific comment. There really has to be, because the level of issues that are being caused right now by a third party in terms of what they are exposing themselves to. There's an old saying, never interrupt the enemy when they're in the process of committing suicide.
There's definitely a lot more factors now regarding this case, but I just wanted to focus on something that stood out to me as someone who used to work at a child support agency. And the thing that I noticed is that this is now a two-state case, meaning that Daisy is in New York and Walter is in Florida, in Miami. And if it stays this way, if Daisy, finishes the pregnancy and gives birth to this child and continues residing in New York, and Walter stays in Florida, what I see is that there will be a battle between Florida and New York to see which courts in which state get to have the jurisdiction to establish the order. And this is significant to me because there's incentives on both sides. It's in Daisy's interest to have New York create the order, and it's in Walter's interest to have Florida create the order. And that's because even though we have child support in all the states, there are differences in the guidelines and the family codes of the states that do create some pretty significant differences. So, for instance, child support in New York actually lasts till age 21, so it doesn't end at 18 like it does here in California, though the exception in California is that if the child is still in high school, then it ends at 19. And in Florida, that looks to be 18 as well. So if you're Walter, just off rip, you're like, if I can get Florida to establish the order and retain jurisdiction, then that means I only have to pay until the child is 18. But if you're Daisy, then you're saying, well, I want New York to do it because I'm going to get an extra 3 years of child support. That's just one thing. Another thing could be like interest on back pay if he doesn't pay. And the other most significant thing to me is the difference in the child support calculator. So the Florida calculator is going to go lighter on Walter than the New York calculator. If New York ends up getting the jurisdiction and they establish the order, he's going to be paying for 3 more years at a higher amount. So what I plan to do for this video is, what I'll do is run us through the interstate guidelines that determine which state can get jurisdiction, and I'll explain to you what a state needs to be able to show in order to say, hey, our courts get to make this order. And then what I'll do is just run us through both the Florida and the New York calculator. We'll do a rough guideline and just see what amounts he might be looking at. The income I'm going to use for him is just a random income that I just chose, $300,000 per year. I don't know how much he makes. I don't really know if anybody knows that except probably Walter. So, obviously these amounts are just for demonstration. Before we get discussing the guidelines, I want everybody to be familiar with this. The Uniform Interstate Family Support Act. These were a set of guidelines that were created to make sure that all states follow these rules so that you don't get something called forum shopping or state shopping. And what that basically means is that, you might have a couple that breaks up and they have a kid. Maybe one of the parties says, you know what? Kansas has too low of child support. I'm going to go to California and I'm going to have California establish the order because they're going to charge more. And it's also to stop things like if one state made a child support order, but then later on, after a few years, somebody moved and then they had another state establish a child support order. Now you have two states with separate child support orders, both charging the same guy. And you just had all these things like creating confusion. So these guidelines were created in order to give something for all states to refer to. So there's no confusion on who gets the authority to make the order. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to use California Family Code to show the guidelines. But these are the same guidelines that all the states use. So we have Uniform Interstate Family Support Act, and this is basically encoded into the California Family Code. And if you see right here, it says, in a proceeding to establish or enforce a support order to determine parentage of a child, a tribunal of this state may exercise personal jurisdiction over a non-resident individual. So a non-resident individual would be like Walter, right? So if Daisy's in New York and New York is looking at starting this case, Walter would be a non-resident of New York, or the individual's guardian or conservator if, and here are the guidelines. If the individual is personally served with notice within this state. So this could happen by, let's say Daisy gives birth to the child and, she's keeping it cool with Walter and she's like, Walter, why don't you just come by? I'm not mad at you anymore. Why don't you just come see the baby? I know you weren't here at the hospital and I just really want you to see the baby. He flies to New York. She calls up the child support agency and she's like, hey, Walter's coming. He's going to be here on this date at this time. Make sure you have a process server here to serve him while he's here visiting the child. And then what will happen is he'll get served with New York's action. And then just by the fact that they personally served him, New York's going to have jurisdiction. And then that's it. It's a New York case. Child support's going to 21. Okay, if that doesn't happen, the individual submits to the jurisdiction of the state by consent in a record, by entering a general appearance, or by filing a responsive document having the effect of waiving any contest to personal jurisdiction. So what this means is that New York might say, you know what, let's just file a complaint here with the court and let's mail it to him, and then he's going to get a document in the mail and it's going to say, hey, you're being sued for child support and this is what we're asking for. And we're also trying to establish paternity of this kid. And he might look at that, and if he decides to respond to it, meaning he files an answer to the complaint and it gets, filed with the New York court over there, that could automatically give them jurisdiction. So he wasn't served with it personally, but he does acknowledge receipt of it because he filled out a response to the case, basically. And then that by default just says, okay, New York is good to do this. So if that doesn't happen, the individual resided with the child in this state. Probably not going to happen in this case. I mean, this is for people who have a kid together and, they were still together prior to the breakup, but I don't really think that's going to happen in this case. The individual resided in this state and provided prenatal expenses or support for the child. That one, I don't think is going to happen. I don't know if Walter's ever lived in New York or if he's going to. But we did hear Daisy a couple times kind of asking him or mentioning stuff about him, helping with the medical bills for the birth and being a man and helping to pay for things, So it could get wiry there if Walter is participating and paying for expenses for this child. So it's highly advisable for him not to until the courts do their thing and actually determine him to be the father, because he may not be. This one is really important right here. Number 5. The child resides in this state as a result of the acts or directives of the individual. This is something that we've kind of seen get kind of discussed here, because Daisy has come out and said that, she moved from China to go live with Walter and that she gave up her job or whatever it is she had out there to go live with Walter and be his girlfriend, I guess. and that basically Walter's the one who, you know, sort of kicked her out or didn't want to get her an apartment, or wanted his space from her. And she was pregnant in that time of being with him there in Miami. And because he's the one who sent her on her way, she had no choice but to go to New York, because she couldn't stay in Florida, because she doesn't have any family there, any friends to help take care of her, and Walter wouldn't do it. So in this way, the court can say that by Walter's directive and acts, Daisy ended up in New York because she had nowhere else to go, and that's why she's living here. And just that, even if they don't serve him, even if he doesn't pay for any prenatal expenses, if he doesn't file a response, like, just that is enough to say, okay, you know what, we're going to actually go into court and say this is what gives us jurisdiction. And the next thing, which is also relevant, is the individual engaged in relations in this state, and the child may have been conceived by that act of intercourse. So that was a big one. You know, when people would come into the child support agency, and, you know, if I'm talking to mom and she's like, yeah, you know, I was living in New York, he still lives in New York, but me and the child are living here, that perks up my ears. And then one of the things we ask him is, you know, where was the child conceived? If they say, yeah, it was when we were living together in New York, then in my mind, I'm already like, okay, I have to get her information and send it to New York, and then New York's courts has to actually establish the order, instead of saying me just asking the California court across the street from our agency to do it. So we do know that the child was conceived in Miami. I mean, that's what she's come out and said. And so far from what I've heard of the case, this child was conceived in Florida. And typically what would happen is that, you know, if you're a New York caseworker, you're going to say, all right, well, let me just get your information, Daisy. I'm going to have you fill out this big packet, and we're going to send that over to Florida, and their courts are going to deal with this. But since some of these other actions, particularly number 5, which says the child resides in the state as a result of the acts or directives of the individual, it could be that New York, and it's not that it could be, New York does have a claim to be able to say, hey, we have jurisdiction for this, and we're going to make a New York order. Now, another thing of note to me is that on the recent stream in which Myron and Walter addressed the allegations, James Sexton appeared, and it appears he's representing Walter. Now, what we know about James Sexton, I like James Sexton, by the way. I love that soft white underbelly interview and all these things and all this stuff, is that he's a New York lawyer. So if Walter is already, I guess, retaining James to represent him on the case, then maybe just by virtue of that, the child support case is going to be looked at in New York, which, to be honest, in my opinion, is already a loss. If I'm James Sexton, I'm hoping he's explaining to Walter that it's in his best interest to have Florida look at the case and not New York. Because remember, if it's New York, it's an extra 3 years of child support. It's going to be a higher amount and possibly more interest on arrears amongst whatever else, you know. So that's significant to me. I don't want to doubt James Sexton. I'm sure he already knows this, but as this case goes on, we'll find out. We'll find out what happens. So just before we end, what I'm going to do is I'm going to run you through the calculators. And we're going to look at Florida, and we're going to look at New York. And I'm going to be using $300,000 for an annual income. This is just the number I'm pulling out of the air. I'm doing $300,000 a year for Walter, $0 for her, because she has claimed that she's like not working. And, you know, she gave up her career to go be with him. And then he gave her the boot. So she had to go stay with a friend at her apartment in New York. And that's where she's going to be. And so she's getting help. It doesn't seem like she has actual income right now. And her being pregnant, I mean, I just don't know the likelihood of her, you know, starting work. We'll see what happens. And I'm also going with 0 custody. So I'm assuming that, you know, she's going to give birth to the child and Walter's going to have 0 custody. So by the time this hits the courts, Walter will have 0 or next to 0 custody of this child, especially if he hasn't, you know, accepted paternity of the child, right? Another one of these things in the UIFSA guidelines that would give jurisdiction is if he signs a paternity declaration at the hospital in that state. So if he went to New York during the birth and he signs a voluntary declaration of paternity at the hospital, and it gets filed with New York State, that would also give them jurisdiction. So that would be number 7. The individual has filed a declaration of paternity maintained in this state by the Department of Child Support Services. So let's get into the calculators. Okay, so this is Florida. And as you can see here, I put $25,000 in the monthly. Let me make that bigger for you. So we're saying the father, which is Walter, the alleged father, is making $25,000 net monthly income. And mom is making 0. And I went ahead and we scrolled down here a bit. Right here is custody. It says number and percentage of overnight stays with each parent. So I said Daisy has 365 days a year with the child, and he has 0. And if we scroll down, we're seeing actual child support to be paid is going to be $2,155 a month. Okay, so $2,155 a month with no custody. You know, if you're Walter, I mean, he could probably, I said they as if it's the podcast paying it. He could probably afford this if he's making, you know, some decent money from the streams and all that. I don't think that'd be the end of the world for him. Okay, now here's New York. So this is going to be the New York child support calculator, and we're doing this for one child, and I've entered $300,000 for the annual income, and this is a pretty, I think this is just an estimate. This calculator, I'm sure the one that the caseworker's using is more comprehensive. This doesn't even let me put in custody, so this is just what's open to the public. But we're getting an annual amount of $45,900 a year. So that's not a month. So a month he'd be paying $3,825, right? So that's different from the $2,155. We're looking at $3,825. Okay, so that's significant, right? I mean, we have, you know, over $1,500, at least, you know, whatever the math is on that, more a month. With the same income and ostensibly the same custody, since it wouldn't let me put that in there. This is just an estimate. And we also have that going on for 3 years longer, right? So that's going till age 21, and it's not dropping off at age 18. So there are incentives here for either party to ask their own state to be the one to create the child support order. And it's yet to be seen if it's going to be Florida, if it's going to be New York. I mean, I think anything can happen in this case at this point. A few weeks might go by and she might just say, this is just too much. I don't want to deal with this headache anymore. Everybody's talking about it. I'm just going to get the abortion. It's just going to go away. James Sexton is looking like he's going to file some type of criminal case against her for releasing this footage because it's apparently a felony. He might file that case. She might be looking at some jail time. They might say, hey, listen, we'll drop the case, but you sign an NDA and we'll slip you some money on the side and never talk about this again. This goes away. I really don't know, you know, and then we don't even really know how much income Walter actually makes. So there are, you know, and it could be he takes the paternity test and it just happens to be not his baby. I mean, anything can happen at this point. But this is just purely a hypothetical based off if he is the father, if she does stay in New York, if he is making around that much money. And I hope you guys learned something just about how this stuff kind of works. If you like this video, hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, leave a comment down below. I'm definitely interested to hear what you have to say, and we'll see you on the next video.